Hello, everyone, and welcome to this FINTRAIL webinar on managing and conducting financial crime investigations. My name is Maya Brain. I am the Managing Director and Head of Insights and Research at FINTRAIL, and it is a great pleasure to have you all with us this afternoon and to welcome our panel of expert speakers. I'm just going to start off with a super quick overview of FINTRAIL and who we are for anyone who is not familiar with this. Can I just check with someone if you can see the slides? It's coming up as a grey box on my screen.
I have a white screen.
Okay, I will. Sorry, 1 second. That is strange. Okay, well, I will give a quick introduction to FINTRAIL without the aid of the slide. That's not a problem. We're a financial crime consultancy with a focus on using financial and regulatory technology to help firms manage their exposure to financial crime risk. So a real focus on digital banking and the fintech and regtech space. And we wanted to put together this webinar because looking across the team, we realized the wealth of investigative experience that we had, and that this was a real topic of interest and a particular passion of a lot of us in the team. So one of our co-founders, Gemma Rogers, was the global head of the business intelligence unit at HSBC, and latterly the deputy global head of the financial intelligence unit. Another couple of team members, including myself, were part of that financial intelligence unit at HSBC. We have Andy Morrison, who's going to be talking later, who joined us from the City of London Police, where he conducted financial crime investigations from a law enforcement perspective. Several of us on the team have worked for business intelligence and investigations firms, again, looking at financial crime issues from money laundering to sanctions evasion, bribery and corruption. So it's an area where we had this passionate interest and lots of expertise, and really wanted to come together with other figures in the industry to have this session on best practice sharing and insights from the fintech, regtech, traditional banking space. So I will dispense with the slides as they do not seem to be working. And I will introduce our panel for the first session. So there should be a slide covering the agenda, but I will just run through it verbally. We're going to start with a panel session on managing financial crime investigations, covering governance, information and data, and technology and automation, which will be about 40 minutes. And then we'll move on to the second section, which is Andy Morrison talking about engagement with law enforcement, so understanding how they look at financial crime investigations and how private sector firms can best work with them to maximize the effectiveness of those investigations. And then the third session is a panel session led by my colleague Kira Aitchison, looking at the people and skills for successful financial crime investigations. It is not all about the data and the technology, much as that's often the buzzwords and the focus. You need the right people and the right teams to back it all up. And then we'll try and leave 5 minutes or so at the end for a Q&A, but also we'll be answering questions as we go through and at the end of each of those sessions whilst the topics are still in people's minds. So do drop the questions in the comments box and the questions box as we go through, and we'll try and answer them as we go, and then we can wrap up with any final thoughts and comments at the end. So we'll kick things off with our first panel session, so managing financial crime investigations. And it is my great pleasure to introduce our panel for this session, who hopefully you can all see now on screen. So we'll start with Vito Armonovicius, who is the Group Head of AML, CTF and Complex Investigations Lead at Revolut. And Vito has previously managed financial crime investigations teams at Barclays and Western Union, so has a great range of expertise across all those complementary but different types of financial institutions. And so it's a great coup to have him on the panel. Thank you and welcome, Vito.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Thanks. And next we have Charles Brown, head of community at Black Dot Solutions, which is a regtech firm, the creator of Videris, an online investigations and intelligence platform used by major banks and other FIs and other corporates to utilize really an amazing amount of open source data to conduct financial crime investigations. And Charles has over a decade of experience in conducting financial crime and business intelligence investigations, and then latterly has been working in the RegTech world, developing technological solutions to use the power of data and analytics to support those investigations. So welcome, Charles.
Great to be here.
And finally, Sylvia Wallace, the head of product strategy at Ground Truth Intelligence. So Ground Truth Intelligence is a platform connecting financial institutions and other users to a vetted global network of investigators as a one-stop platform for supporting due diligence investigations and research. And as a former investigator myself, and I used to work with subcontractors conducting on-the-ground source inquiries or manually retrieving records or conducting specific research in particular jurisdictions. So I think this platform is it's a game changer. I flippantly describe it as TaskRabbit for investigations, but it's a really exciting new entrant to the market. And Sylvia is a highly experienced business intelligence expert with over a decade of hands-on experience in public domain research investigations, and previously headed the enhanced due diligence proposition at Refinitiv, and worked with customers across multiple sectors on investigations. So welcome, Sylvia.
Thank you so much for having me here, Maya.
And I have to say, I've really enjoyed a lot of our prep discussions for this call and all of your excellent insights. So really looking forward to this discussion. I will stop talking in just a second, but I just wanted to set the scene first in terms of one of the other reasons we wanted to hone in on this subject of good management of FinCrime investigations, and particularly complex investigations. And this is basically related to a change in mood music, if you like, in the regulatory space, where we're seeing an increased focus on going beyond regulatory obligations and tick box compliance to focus more on effectiveness and outcomes, with the hope that this drives effective, meaningful financial crime reduction and better risk management. And so regulators are expecting more than a tick box approach, so more than a sort of linear process of processing transaction monitoring alerts or incoming inquiries from law enforcement, to move into more complex, proactive, risk-based and intelligence-led investigations. And along with that, producing metrics for complex investigations, understanding the effectiveness, better use of intelligence, better link up and follow through with law enforcement, etc. And also bringing reputational risk. There's also an internal pressure to sort of bring reputational risk into this, as well as meeting just the regulatory requirements. And so conducting proactive investigations or intelligence-led investigations that can help firms manage risks beyond purely regulatory ones, so things like reputational risk. And we see this the perfect example at the moment with the number of firms pulling back from operating in Russia, even when there's no regulatory obligation for them to do so, but due to public pressure and the reputational issues, they have decided not to engage in that sort of business. And so investigations that help firms understand the business they're doing and who their clients and the counterparties are also starts to feed into that process. So kicking off this discussion with looking at some of the governance around managing investigations, and with an eye on that question of the different types of investigations, so proactive versus reactive investigations. Vito, maybe we can turn to you to start with. So that's something you're actively considering at the moment at Revolut in building out the complex investigations team. So could you talk us through some of the distinction between the different kinds of investigations, proactive and reactive, and some of the considerations as to how they differ and how you can make sure that you manage them all effectively?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we talk about reactive investigations, proactive investigations, probably it's best to sort of very briefly describe, what these are. So any reactive investigation would typically be initiated by from like a financial institution perspective, on the back of some sort of referral or other trigger event. And these events might be as simple as internally generated automated alerts from transaction monitoring or screening systems, but also findings from sort of ad hoc reviews, periodic reviews into customers' activities, or also internal or external referrals that they might be getting. And the reality is that absolute majority of investigations teams are busy with reactive investigations, as they usually have to focus on, as what I call like fighting fires. There's always some sort of urgent request from law enforcement, or regulators. There's something escalated internally, so they're really busy with that, and there will always be these reactive investigations to undertake, manage, and many businesses understand that, and therefore would focus on hiring people to manage these reactive investigations. Now, on the other hand, we have proactive investigations, which are, well, solely driven internally, I would say, at least in the initial stages anyways. And, they are self-initiated because of a variety of reasons, such as, again, observed existing or emerging threats, patterns that are, observed across multiple business lines or jurisdictions or accounts. And also like lack of knowledge, for example, or not understanding firms' exposure to certain financial crime threats or typologies could also be one of the reasons to initiate this sort of proactive investigations. And these are, more complex investigations and will usually require more time, more planning, internal and external cooperation. And so these are quite different, in scope as well, I would say. Now, it's quite difficult to ensure there is a dedicated person or a team continuously progressing with this proactive work. And yet, I believe that more often than not, these proactive investigations lead to quite significant findings about firms' risk exposure or potential lack of some anti-financial crime controls, other issues that might come not as such a pleasant surprise to the business, right? So if I would continue using the same sort of analogy of firefighting, so this proactive work that is being undertaken to some degree would prevent fires from starting in the first place, and in the longer run would definitely alleviate some pressure from the reactive investigations team.
Yep, agreed. And it is a really good analogy, and it can end up being more cost effective and more efficient to, for instance, to understand if you're dealing with a network of illicit actors and to deal with it as part of one investigation rather than constantly chipping away at it. There's a lot of transaction monitoring alerts or other reactive triggers, but you need to have the resources, as you say, and to have that focus and the ability to conduct larger investigations. And are there considerations about where and how to structure investigations teams, and if you need people with specific expertise in this, or if it's part of the work of more general financial crime analysts?
Yeah, so in terms of structuring investigations teams, that's really sort of a tough question, because I think it will depend on the size or the type of the business, available resources, and many other things. I know some financial institutions, especially those fintechs, early startups, they would have one person probably who's an MLRO, head of compliance, and also undertake investigations. So there are different sort of factors, but more generally, if we talk about sort of more like bigger financial institutions, so these reactive investigations, which are usually less complex, would typically sit within the first line of defense function, and employees working on such investigations would usually require less experience, or the tasks are easy to carry out. So obviously they are not they don't need to be as skilled or qualified as someone sitting in the second line, for example. These specialists are obviously easier to find on the market, including having a bigger pool of candidates in lower cost jurisdictions, for example, right? And another option to sort of consider, if we talk about these reactive, less complex investigation, would be outsourcing some of or even all of the sort of simple tasks to external firm or a vendor. Obviously, there's always this cost versus benefit and risk versus reward considerations, right? When obviously if we focus on proactive investigations, so these are or complex reactive investigations, on the contrary, this would probably sit best within the second line function in probably a higher cost location, or where the HQs are, and so purely because such work requires, in my experience at least, multiple years of experience and specialist knowledge, higher level of critical thinking and planning skills, adaptability, as well as leveraging existing network of your contacts that you have within financial services and perhaps even law enforcement, right, to progress with these proactive investigations. So and if possible, obviously, what I would personally recommend, and as I'm continue sort of building out this complex investigations team at Revolut, I would try and recommend isolating the proactive work, so that is it is really uninterrupted, and continues to progress at all times. So, probably dividing the second line investigation team into reactive and proactive, and sort of like ring fencing that proactive investigation team from all the fires around would probably be a good idea.
Yep, agreed. I guess, and one other consideration in terms of where the complex investigations sit could also be, again, with the size of the business, if you have it as a global investigations team, if it looks like it's a case which spans multiple jurisdictions, and it would be helpful to have data, to the extent you're allowed to see it, across the different jurisdictions and have it coordinated by a global team. So for firms operating in multiple jurisdictions, that could be another consideration. So in terms of defining the scope of an investigation, so whether this starts as a reactive or a proactive investigation, what is some good practice and some good guidance around that, how to define the scope so that you have clear objectives, don't get sidetracked, but at the same time manage to go where the investigation takes you? Charles, maybe we can turn to you to kick us off on that.
Yeah, I mean, so my response to that would be, consider using a device that's a well-used way of framing investigations, and that's something that's been used by military and law enforcement and other sort of institutionalized sort of investigative backgrounds, and that's the intelligence cycle. The intelligence cycle, and I'll get into disagreements with people here who are sort of intelligence fanatics, but there are sort of 5 broad phases to it. The first one being sort of direction and planning, and that's where you sort of define your intelligence requirements, you scope the terms of reference. Essentially, you're creating a framework around a process of taking raw data and turning it into something that can be used to make decisions. And once you've clarified those requirements, you then move on to the sort of second phase of collection, where you go out and start bringing in the necessary data and information you need, and as long as you've followed a robust sort of direction and planning phase, the sort of collection, what it is you need to use to make your decisions, whether that's more internal data, external data, open source, publicly available information, that should all flow down from that initial direction phase. You then move from sort of collection into processing. It's sort of translating documents, structuring information for further analysis. Leads you into an analytical phase of making sense of the data, and again, all of those additional phases feed back into having a solid and robust sort of direction and planning phase. And the sort of the final phase is once you've analyzed the information and determined whether what you've developed is enough to answer those initial questions and address those requirements. You then move into a sort of dissemination phase on where does that information need to go? Who does it need to go to? How do you need to present it? But so I think, I could go into the minutiae of how best to define and scope an investigation, but it depends on the risk appetite of the institution, the risk level of a particular customer, the types of products and services, etc. But I think, in a nutshell, it's a long-winded way of saying, if you're not already using the intelligence cycle as a way of framing your financial crime investigations, perhaps start taking a look at that, and especially focusing on the planning and direction phase and seeing how what's the best practice around doing that.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point as well, that financial firms don't have to reinvent the wheel, that there are frameworks that you can use, and also thinking about it, maybe we'll touch on with Andy later, but thinking about it in similar terms to law enforcement or other investigation fields, having that same sort of way of conceptualizing it could be helpful then in understanding how other parties are looking at these investigations. Sylvia, do you have any thoughts to add to that on defining the scope, and possibly also considering what happens if you get that wrong and if you don't have a clearly defined set of objectives and a clear scope?
Yeah, so one thing I would add to the governance and the scoping, sort of initial planning of the investigation part, would be to think a little bit more about the organization level knowledge management. It's all fantastic and great to hire brilliant people who can, who have the knowledge and who can conduct amazing research or investigation. But brilliant people have this annoying tendency to be promoted or, to be poached to go somewhere else. So how do you, as a business, collect that knowledge, manage that knowledge, and that knowledge is not only the information that what is available, where, how to get it, but what is the regulatory landscape, how is it changing, Risks are dynamic, risks change, data accessibility, data availability change, technology and the tools that we use to conduct investigation, to communicate with stakeholders. All of this is fairly dynamic. So how do you, as an organization, stay on top of that and manage this effectively? And if you do that part correctly, then the scoping and the initial stage of the process will be so much easier for the investigators if they have a reference point to go back to before they sort of start the investigation. And to answer your second question, what happens if you kind of ignore or don't do the scoping bit correctly? If you're very, very lucky, maybe everything will go well, but I don't think anybody in risk management relies so much on luck. So the things that can go wrong are, not rocket science, like in every project. You risk delay of the delivery, you risk busting your budget. But in terms of research and investigation, the biggest kind of threat to the process is missing out on the relevant information, right? And that can have a significant business level, compliance or business level impact. Conversely, I would add, not understanding exactly what's available and what is obtained ethically and legally, and what are sort of those boundaries of doing the research, especially if you rely on external parties, creates another risk of getting some information that actually, in the hindsight, maybe you shouldn't have received access to that, right? And I think it's also as part of scoping. One extra thing I can think of, if you don't plan and communicate correctly with all the stakeholders involved in the investigation, what is the purpose of that investigation, how the information will be used, you're again creating potential issues. So imagine if the documentation the investigator is gathering is supposed to be used as evidence in court, and if it's not, it doesn't follow the appropriate methodology of time-stamping the data and so on, you're creating a risk of the evidence being dismissed in court.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's a point with proactive investigations as well, whereas with reactive ones, there's more of a clear process and it's clear what happens to the findings. With proactive ones, I've seen this happen where you put a lot of work into something and then you share it with a risk committee or senior management and they're like, what is this? What do you want me to do with this? And because it didn't necessarily have a clear trigger, like this was a law enforcement request and so this is what you have to do with it. Exactly. If they're not made aware of the findings as you go along and the fact that you have started this proactive investigation because X, Y, and Z, and this is what you're looking at, you can get to the end and then find that people aren't really sure what to do with the findings. And so having those discussions and making sure you have that, as you mentioned, the interaction, the communication is very important. And so you touched there on what information is available, what should you have access to, what can you access. So that brings us on quite nicely to our second point on information and data. So just we'll set the scene, I guess. So what types of information and data are we talking about here? What are the main sources that we can draw on for financial crime investigations? Vito, do you want to kick us off with this?
Sure. So I'd look at this pretty in a simple way. I think there are basically internal and external sources of information that we can use in both reactive and proactive investigations. So internal sources would typically be your KYC, CDD records and notes, transactional history, customers' digital footprint, and everything else that is stored internally and can be accessed by investigative team. Now, external sources of information would typically be open sources. So your open source research, including social media information and intelligence that can be obtained by doing that investigation and research. But also closed sources such as products or databases offered by other firms that would enhance your intelligence sort of capabilities, your analytical capabilities as well. And so another probably source of external information that I'd like to mention as well that is definitely is the focus at the moment, and a lot of people talk in many forums and discussions is that intelligence and information sharing, obviously via legal gateways with law enforcement, other financial institutions, right? So, it really helps collect additional pieces of information. So sometimes missing pieces of that puzzle, right? Which are usually very, very helpful for that investigation you're undertaking.
Yep, and I think that's something else to really consider is how to make sure that your internal and external sources can work well together, and considering the platforms that you use, so that you can use both most effectively for investigations. So, but having said that, with that focus on your internal data, and then when we talk about external data, really there was from a sort of public source online data. Sylvia, where are the gaps? What will you not get from those two sources, from any of your internal records or open source research? Sorry, desktop-based open source research.
Right. I think there are two main gaps. One is non-digitized content, and the other one is the local expertise. And let me explain a little bit more about each of those. It's data, big data, online resources, and sort of tools and technology that supports this aggregation, access to the digitized information is a very exciting topic. A lot of going on in the market. Fantastic tools technology provides. But at the end of the day, and it's a very sexy topic. But at the end of the day, we're left with lots of situations where data is simply in a non-digitized format, right? Or it's simply impossible to be aggregated, impossible to be accessed from your desk through your desktop research. What if your investigation takes you to Somalia, Nicaragua, and you need registry records or litigation checks that are only available for a local registered practicing lawyer? But you don't even have to go that far. If you want to access registry checks in Spain, and your investigative team doesn't have a credit card, how are you going to get it? Like, is it effective to ask your business on the ground to pay that few euro and get the registry records? They've included a paywall kind of 10 years ago, and you have the gap in the process. So definitely data and digitized data. It's obviously the first step, and wealth of information is out there in digitized content, but in the risk sort of logic and risk-based approach, when you're looking at less transparent locations, remote locations where the digitization of the content is maybe not as progressed as in Western world or sort of Northern Hemisphere, you have to accept that you need to have efficient process and kind of managing of the knowledge of what is that process, how do I go and get that when I need it, rather than scrambling around and thinking, oh my goodness, how do I find somebody in Spain to get those registry records? And the second aspect, as I mentioned, is that local context and local expertise. Local expertise is so much more than knowledge of the language, right? I'm probably a little bit biased here because I just finished reading another book by Peter Pomerantsev recently, so I'm under his influence. Everything is propaganda, politically biased, troll farms, and it's just so hard to get to the truth. We are in the war where the data information is sort of the weapon. We're weaponizing the information, but kind of living this dramatic aspect of that. In practical terms, it's really, really hard to just translate something without understanding of the local context. And it's not necessarily only adverse information or news. It could be litigation records. There are certain locations where private prosecution is possible, and people can you can find a criminal record on somebody you're looking at, but without understanding the context, what actually was the motivator, was it public prosecution, private prosecution, and kind of being able to analyze that. What are you going to do with this information? Once you find something, you have to report it. So you also need that local expertise and that content that is at this point in time, I think the machines simply can't replace humans.
Agreed. And I think that is another interesting, brings us on to an interesting point. ask a question in a minute about using technology to kind of sift through and process the data, but it's about moving from that point where there are technological tools that can gather a lot of information for you, but then the next step is how do you make sense of it? And with the amount of information that's available, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. There is more information out there, but you have to know what to do with it. You have to know what is relevant, what's reliable, and be able to put it in some kind of context. And as you say, depending on the jurisdiction and depending on where the information comes from, you know, on the one hand, there's the extreme view of, you know, fake news and propaganda, etc. But I mean, even within mainstream media publications, knowing which ones have a particular political bent within certain countries, that's going to be more extreme than others. You definitely do need that expertise to make sense of the information you've gathered. So Charles, maybe I can turn to you on that point. So with so much data from so many different sources, it's one thing to have teams, and whether that's people and the tools to gather all that information. How can we use technology to partly to automate that process and the gathering of information, and then also making sense of it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you know, we've slightly flipped this issue on its head. It's less about leveraging automation, you know, to make sense of information, you know, directly, and it's more about where within the investigative process you can leverage automation in order to allow sort of expert human investigators to make better sense of the information. And I know that seems like you know, it's quite nitpicky, but you know, often people are trying to rush to technology to automate, you know, the sort of what we call the big red investigate button. You sort of, you know, press go and it goes out, scoops it up, analyzes it all, prepares a report for you, and you know, there's very little sort of human touch. So I think, you know, we focused on where we can automate key aspects of the investigative process. So things like you know, striking a balance between being able to go out and collect from a wide range of sources, but then easily filter through and just pick out the bits of information you need. So, you know, technologies like ours allow you to imagine you're sort of trawling with a fishing net, but then spear fishing for the bits of information you need. So automation can do that. It can help, you know, go out and I guess categorize, you know, results that you've brought in on the one hand. How else can automation help you make better sense of information? Tools that allow you to automatically visualize the information you bring in. So if you're bringing in, say, corporate records, there are tools that allow you, like ours, that allow you to very quickly, you know, use you know, graph analytics to not just produce, you know, pretty looking network diagrams, but also identify in an automated way connections between disparate bits of data. So highlighting connections between, you know, a set of you know, social media followers or friends and directors. If you've got an individual who's claiming they have no link to a particular organizational jurisdiction, but actually you find out that this individual is, you know, close friends on a social media platform with you know, with an organization they're claiming to have no connection with, that's, you know, that's useful. So again, that's an example of the importance of looking beyond traditional, or certainly looking beyond internal data, looking beyond structured risk and compliance data sets, and thinking about you know, using technology to harness the wider power of the internet, you know, in its broadest possible sense, dark web data, social media data, etc. But there's also, you know, automation can help you if the ultimate purpose is to free up expert investigators to make better judgments and make better decisions on the information they've got, then, you know, try and free up as much of their time as possible. So automate, for example, the process of referencing where that information's come from, so that at a later stage, if you need to explain to an internal auditor or a regulator how you retrieve that information, when you retrieved it, perhaps it's been taken from a site that's you know, subsequently been taken down and removed. If you're using tools that automate the process of logging when that data was brought in and how you used it again, you know, it reduces what we call the swivel chair approach of having multiple tools and tabs and databases and things open. And if you can use technology that brings all of those processes in one place, again, it just frees up the expert investigator to go, right, what does this mean? And more importantly, also, you know, where does this information need to go and how do we need to use it? So coming back to Sylvia's earlier point about, you know, not seeing investigations as a kind of one and done. I've filed my report, I've sent it off to, you know, filed a SAR, I've sent it off to a reputational risk committee. But can we use this to better train our TM systems? Can we use this to better educate people internally? Can I use this to convince senior stakeholders that it was a great decision to procure this piece of technology? So, and the way in which you report those findings from an investigation will be completely different. It might be a half-page summary for one person. It might be a 4-page newsletter that goes out internally in other instances. So, using tools that help you to automate all of those things ultimately frees up the investigator to make better sense of the information they've received.
Yeah, I love that. And it's a message that we stress a lot. It's not a question of the technology replacing the people. It is about freeing them up to do the actual value-added work. And the idea that investigations don't have to worry about referencing and audit trails anymore is joy to everyone's ears. I don't think anyone minds the technology picking up that part of it. So in the interest of time, I guess move on to considering technological tools and automated approaches. So Vito, as an investigative manager, how do you start thinking about what technology you need, what tools you want to build or buy, what to prioritize? How do you work out your wish list and the tools which you need to have?
Yeah, so again, I generally look at what we currently have internally, and would try and leverage as much as possible. So looking at all the existing tools and just trying to see if we could maybe even adjust some of them, all of them, to better suit our needs, right? As we continue sort of building out new functions, so probably these tools can and should be adjusted. So I look, internally what's available, but then obviously not everything will be available internally. And at this point, I'd start, look externally, grading any any tool needs into sort of must-haves and nice-to-haves, right? Because everything will come with a cost. So probably looking at what's the must-have for the team, what will be the biggest benefit, so I'd focus on tools that would save time for the team and obviously improve our investigative capabilities and outputs. Is exactly what comes to mind first, right? And then all of these nice to haves is obviously very useful, but it might be internally a little bit difficult to get approvals to buy something that is just a nice to have, right? So for example, if we talk about complex investigations, proactive investigations, first what I would like to have, obviously some sort of a tool that would help visualize all of these complex networks, complex structures, multiple accounts, networks of individuals and companies, right? Obviously we can not have that tool and just detail our findings in a 10-page report, right? But at the end of the day, you want that to visualize, like a picture speaks 1,000 words, right? So, and unfortunately, I've not seen instances where firms would develop something like this internally, and would instead go for some big firms that could produce some sort of and procure these sort of tools for investigations teams.
Yeah, I think that's always been the top of our wish list in every investigations team I've worked in, is the network diagrams. It's like the #1 most rewarding thing. So if you've considered that, okay, this is a particular need we have, we need a tool that can do X or Y, what are some factors to consider when looking at different providers? Charles, could you give some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm coming at this from the perspective of a vendor rather than a buyer, but I think we've developed our platform based on the feedback of numerous financial institutions. So I think what I'm going to say is going to be fairly universal. Definitely picking up on Vito's first 2 points: accessibility and intuitiveness. There's no point procuring a solution that requires a PhD in computer science to run unless you've got a team of analysts who have PhDs in computer science. So something that is easily accessible and intuitive, it doesn't take long to be trained up on, and you can start producing valuable output from it as quickly as possible, I think is definitely a priority, as well as Vito said, and as you've suggested, Maya, visualization. It's no longer about individual transactions and customers, it's all about clusters and networks. And so it's not a nice to have, it's a must have. If you're not utilizing graph database technology and network visualization analytics, you're definitely missing a trick. And And also done well and harnessed properly, those sorts of technologies, again, allow you to have an ongoing database that you can query, because a network that's being used to facilitate money laundering may also be used in sanctions evasion or terror financing or wildlife trafficking or whatever. So, having those sorts of tools, it doesn't just paint a pretty picture that you can tack on to the end of a report and send off. There's an ongoing benefit. You see it as a living, breathing database that you can query on an ongoing basis. I think just very quickly, integratability, the ability to plug into other internal systems, case management platforms, etc. That's got to be key, rather than having something just sitting there as a standalone solution. The ability to work, to escalate within the investigative platform across teams. The ability to collaborate on a project within a team if it's a particularly complex, ongoing case. You might want multiple people working on the same project. So platforms that allow not just that collaboration, but also allows, a manager to be able to segment out elements of an investigation. That's pretty key. And then, as I mentioned earlier, something that perhaps speeds up that process of explainability and logs what you do and how you do it. I think that's pretty key. It saves a lot of time, frees up your people to do more valuable things.
Yeah, agree. It's an excellent range of points. One thing that's just occurred to me, actually, it's a point we've raised with some clients, actually, is that it can also be really, really helpful if there are any other potential use cases for the tool within the business, because we've seen this in a couple of cases recently where tools which have used for screening, but also for more in-depth investigations, have been really useful to procurement departments and also to HR, doing other kinds of screening on other counterparties. And so the fact that the compliance team was able to say, look, this tool would actually be really useful across the business and to get more support made it much easier for them to acquire the budget for it. So that's a really nice angle if you can make it work. But again, thinking not just in silos of is there anything else we could use this tool for? Does it have any other benefits? So on our final point, just to end on a negative note, because why not? Technology and automation can obviously be hugely helpful. It's clearly the way to manage larger, more complex investigations and to make the most of all the data available. But it does obviously throw up its own set of problems, and there are potential risks and things to be aware of and to consider if we move towards greater automation and use of technology in the investigative process. So I wonder if I could canvass some final thoughts on that. Sylvia, do you have a thought to kick us off on that?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think it's a must, and technology, it's a fantastic tool, right? But we should be aware and stay updated on what are the best tools, how we use them, but also what are the gaps, right? I think in the unknown unknowns are the biggest risks. So working and in a structured way towards understanding which tools are best to use now, how tools are changing, and to the point that Charles made earlier, a collaboration among the teams with the external stakeholders, but also among the tools that the investigators are using, right? And I think the challenge that I see is that there are brilliant solutions to very specific problems, technical solutions to very specific problems, right? But they kind of live in silos. And they solve one problem, but if they don't work with the other solutions that you're using, they could create inefficiencies in other parts of the research or investigation or the overall management problem. So I think being aware of what's possible, what's not possible, accepting that there is no red button, investigate and get everything sorted properly, beautifully without any human involved. And embracing that and working towards realistic targets, I think that's the way to go forward.
Yeah. Any final thoughts from Vito or Charles on that one?
Just quickly, maybe one last point from me about the technology. Actually, I was thinking, and it's something that Charles mentioned before is how well that technology or automation, can work with your existing systems and your existing configurations, right? This is, I think, is super important. And just to also highlight one problem, and obviously, something that is known, that behind any tool technology, there's always people, right? And so they create, they maintain that, and then if so, and how they do it, there's always a risk as to how that technology is maintained, what the inputs are, quality of that underlying data, and as also Charles mentioned, explainability, right? So it's all of these factors are very important, I think, to take into account. So and truly to be wary of.
I agree. And Charles, any final thoughts from you on that one?
Yeah, a quick one is, and this is maybe slightly counterintuitive coming from a technology company, but quite often these discussions around automation, it's sort of linking innovation and doing things better with more automation. And to sort of answer the question directly, what do we need to be wary of? Perhaps think about innovating more broadly. It's about people, process, and technology. So where can you bring in automation, perhaps to reduce headcount in one area, but then perhaps build a small team of dedicated individuals in another area to do more complex tasks with some technology to help automate aspects of that work. So thinking about, financial crime investigations and innovation around that in a broader sense.
Yep, agree. It's an excellent point, and harks back to what we said before, that automation and tech can't replace people. It just frees them up to do more useful work, and ultimately to make the final decisions. The technology is never going to make your risk appetite based decisions for you. That has to be done by individuals within a carefully defined framework. So hopefully, that will segue nicely into our upcoming section on people and teams. So in the interest of time, I'm going to wrap up this panel session for now. We'll save the questions and hopefully get to them at the end. Thank you all very much for joining for that discussion. That was great, and some really, really great insights there. So I'm going to hand over now to Andy Morrison, and hopefully we've got the slides. We can get this working again. So over to you, Andy.
Thank you, Maya. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to give a talk now on law enforcement engagement. I'm just going to share my screen quick. Perfect. Okay, so for the next 15 or 20 minutes, I'm just going to discuss engagement with law enforcement. Full disclosure, I myself am ex-law enforcement. I spent 13 years in the police, the last 7.5 with City of London Police as a financial crime analyst, and latterly a financial investigator. I have quite a few years of experience of collaborating with the private sector for the successful investigations. I'm a firm believer in collaboration, and I personally think that, I know this, I think we all know as well, it is impossible to solve financial crime. It's possible to investigate financial crime without law enforcement and the private sector working together. I'm going to cover a couple of case studies, 2 investigations that I worked on, and I'm going to go over some of the pain points that I experienced, some of the reasons that I believe those pain points exist, and then I'll go into a couple of things like key takeaways that I think that the industry should be aware of, and hopefully give a little bit of context and a little bit of explanation about maybe why the police engage in certain ways that people in the private sector may not think is the right way to go about it, but generally it's because their hands are tied. If you go to the next slide, please, Maya. So first of all, I spent my career in the police in the UK, in England and Wales. So the examples I'm going to give are from a UK perspective, from a policing of England or Wales perspective. They are fairly analogous. I do know that, for example, in America, although they do use different terms, the route is pretty much identical, and it is, I believe, fairly identical for most other jurisdictions, at least in kind of Western Europe and maybe some of the FATF countries. It should be fairly the same. So I will use some UK terms, and I apologise for that. But yeah, the route used and the way the police interact with the private sector, it should be fairly identical to other jurisdictions as well. So first of all, there are legal gateways for accessing information. In the UK, we are governed by the Human Rights Act. So Article 8 of the Human Rights Act gives a right to privacy, a right to a private life, private and family life. Because of that, you can't just approach a company and have them disclose information about a private individual. Similarly, we have GDPR in Europe. Again, it protects private information. So because of that, we need legal gateways in order to access this information. In the UK, these are the Tornia rules and FIG inquiries, Data Protection Act request, and court orders. So the Tornia rules are the rules that set out how you access this information and what information can be provided. Mr. Tornier was a gentleman in the late 80s, early 90s, who sued his bank after the bank disclosed personal information about him to a future employer, to his current employer, and he actually lost his job. The bank disclosed information that he had a gambling habit, effectively, and his company decided that that wasn't good enough, and they got rid of him. He sued his bank and said that that's his private information. They shouldn't have disclosed that. He did win the case. It's a little bit more complex than just a win. But following that, certain rules were put in place about what can and can't be disclosed for financial inquiries. FIG is the Financial Intelligence Gateway, off the top of my head. Sorry, mine's just gone blank. And that is a NCA, National Crime Agency of the UK, and UK FIU led effectively a list of all accredited and authorized individuals within law enforcement and the regulators who can access this information from banks. It's basically it's a big spreadsheet. It has everyone's name on who is authorized, and banks have access. Traditional banks, and we'll get into that in a little bit, but traditional banks have access to this information, and they can then confirm that someone calling up for information, they are actually authorized to have that information. Data Protection Act 2018. So this came in after the EU rollout of the GDPR legislation. The Data Protection Act effectively it indemnifies the bank for providing information. So private information that they shouldn't be providing to a third party. The Data Protection Act allows a legal route for law enforcement or other kind of government bodies, quangos, etc., regulators to access that information. It provides basically an exemption. And finally, we have court orders. So a court order is, as it states, it is an application to court, and a judge will have read that. They will either have agreed to it or not agreed to it. And if they agree to it, that court order then compels the person who holds information, which will likely be the financial institution, to release that information. If you don't release it, you actually are in contempt of court. Court orders do have time limits on them as well. So it will say you need to be released within 7 days, 21 days, 14 days, etc. Not once in my police career did a bank ever release information within the stated time limit that the judge had put. So technically they all should be in contempt of court, and whoever was running that team or running that department should have been called up in front of the judge and had to explain why they hadn't adhered to the time frame. In practice, it doesn't really happen. Not that I've never heard it happen, simply because we're all aware that businesses have other competing issues to deal with. They have records could be stored elsewhere. It could be I know the legacy banks, with the traditional banks, they have some of them have very archaic systems. It's quite difficult to get information out, especially when we're talking about historical cases. So it's never actually happened, but it is something to be aware of. And police can get a little bit stroppy, especially with time-sensitive investigations. If, say, there's a 7-day request for information and 21 days later you're still waiting for it, and there's no update from the bank. If we go to the next slide, please, Maya. So continuing with the legal, back one. There's a slight delay on the screen change. So continuing with the legal routes for engagement. A successful investigation would likely use all three methods, to obtain information for the investigation. Initial inquiries will be Tornier or FIG inquiries. Once they have some idea of information, they might want to find out some specific or confirm some specific facts about an investigation, about an account, or about an account holder. They would likely submit a Data Protection Act request for confirmation. Once they have that, and say the investigation is going to go ahead, and they need, say, historical account data, transaction data, personal data on devices used or addresses of the person, it will progress to a court order. During the lifetime of an investigation, it's very likely that there will be multiple court orders obtained, but also multiple, say, FIG inquiries. So it's not, you wouldn't start with a FIG and then end of a court order and not go back to a FIG. You'll continue with all three methods as the investigation progresses. FIG inquiries, so under the Tournier rules, FIG inquiries are normally conducted via phone to a traditional bank. This has slightly changed in recent years with the rise of fintechs. Obviously, traditional banks have large call centers. They have hundreds of staff working in their financial crime teams, and police and law enforcement are able to pick up the phone, call someone, get some information, put the phone down, and move forward. It's changed slightly in recent years. So with the fintechs, I've not found one that has a publicly available phone number for police to call up unless it's the actual MLRO. Normally, law enforcement have to email, which does slow down the transfer of information, and it's something I'll discuss at the end. But it can prove an issue with investigations, especially with time-sensitive investigations. With data protection act requests, these are legal documents, so this will be submitted via email to the financial institution. They will then reply with whatever specific information they require. And with a court order, very similar to a DPA, it will be after the judge has signed it and passed it back to the officer, it will be submitted electronically. You should be aware that information disclosed under Tournier rules and under FIG inquiries is generally not admissible in court. It's disclosed as intelligence only. So if an officer calls up and they ask for information and it's confirmed via the phone or confirmed via a FIG inquiry, if they want to use that information for a criminal case or even for a civil case, they will have to go back to the people that hold that information, so the financial institution, and apply either via DPA or more likely via court order. The slight difference with fintechs is that because they don't have call centers and everything's done via email, coming towards the end of my career, I left in late last year, but we tended not to do Tournier rules or FIG inquiries with the fintechs, or fintechs tended not to do them for us, I should say. Fintechs demanded basically the minimum a Data Protection Act request prior to the release of any information. Obviously, that indemnifies the organisation that's releasing the information. However, it does slow things down significantly. We weren't able to call up, say, not going to pick up a bank, but say Monzo, big bank. I was unable to call them up and have a balance inquiry done in a few seconds. It had to be done via email. It's not the worst situation. I can see it from both sides now. I'm in the private sector, but it's something to bear in mind. If law enforcement are chasing up or are emailing a fintech and are chasing for information, it may well be that it's time sensitive. Prior to attending court for any financial investigation, you'd normally have to obtain balance inquiries and kind of recent transactions for a subject. So you may have 5 or 6 balance inquiries to do. Previously, 10 minutes of phone calls. These days with fintechs, you may be looking at 1, 2, 3 days of emailing to get that answer. So if officers are chasing via email, they're not being aggro. It's just that they probably do have a court date coming up and they really need that information. So it's something to bear in mind. Looking at it from the private sector, having a written record of requests rather than just a phone call and someone's notepad, it makes sense to me. But yeah, it does slow things down significantly. Next slide, please, Maya. So the next couple of slides, I'm just going to talk about a couple of investigations that I led before I left the police. Both of them involved significant interaction with financial institutions, one of them with fintechs and traditional banks, the other one mainly with, I think there was one fintech with the other one, but it was mainly traditional banks. They were slightly different. One was a very time-sensitive investigation that required quite a lot of help from the fintech. The other one was a much slower investigation, but it involved huge amounts of data being transferred from the financial institution to the police. And there were issues with that as well. So the first one, this was a Italian organised crime group. It was actually the 'Ndrangheta, which is the biggest mafia group in the world, I think, last time I checked. They were doing what mafia do, and they were laundering money out of Italy and into the UK banking system, because we all know the London banking system is very, very safe. So if you're a criminal and you're looking to keep your money safe. So they were transferring money out from Italy via fintech, via a transfer agent into a traditional bank account in the UK. So this was actually a sensitive financial disclosure from the fintech, who, and this is a credit to them, even though the criminals were not doing anything too out there, that too obviously suspicious, the fintech had identified it as suspicious simply because there was no need to go via them. I hope this makes sense, but the fintech obviously charge a fee. The transfer agent charges a fee for the money to come across, and the transfer agent, whilst they could have happily taken the fee and not had any issue with it at all, they thought it was odd that the criminals were paying a fee to move money when they could have moved it straight from the bank to the UK bank. So again, they had no, say, historical information or no open source information identifying the person as involved in crime. However, by the simple fact that the route was not as direct as they would have expected, they flagged it as suspicious, and it resulted in this investigation. If you could do the next slide, please, Maya. So with this investigation, as I said, it was a fintech transferring the money to a traditional bank. The fintech grew suspicious due to the route of the transfer. It was a large amount of money over quite a short period of time, and just because the way that they transferred it, it didn't ring correct with the fintech. They submitted a SAR, which we acted upon. Initially, being a fintech, when the SAR came across, there was no phone number to actually call back and clarify details. And this is one takeaway that we'll discuss at the end. But submission of a SAR, it really needs to include all information that may be that the police may need to kind of clarify details, because they are very, very time sensitive. In the UK, legislation says that a decision on SAR must be made within 7 days. In reality, you're only looking at maybe 3, maybe 4 days max. By the time the SAR has gone from the reporting institution via the NCA and then to the actual law enforcement agency, to the police force, they probably have just a couple of days, and in that day, in those few days, they have to do the preliminary investigation. They have to identify suspicions enough to freeze that money. So the fintech made the SAR. My first engagement with the fintech was attempted via Turnio rules and FIG inquiries. Unfortunately, because it was a fintech, they wanted stuff via DPA. So submission of a DPA. They were very, very proactive though. They got back. They had one person assigned to the case. Obviously, they recognised that it was time sensitive. So they had one person assigned to it. So I had one single point of contact to go to at the fintech, which was extremely very helpful. They replied to information, made a decision, we froze the money. With the traditional bank, that was slightly different in that I could approach them via the phone. So straight away, I can make phone inquiries. We could identify the accounts where the money was going. Using that information, I was then able to apply for a freezing order. We froze the money. We move forward. There's something else about this case that I'll talk about at the end, and that's the quality of the information or the format of the information that was supplied. But I'll cover that at the end because there's issues with both traditional banks and with fintechs with this area. So if you go to the next slide, please, Maya. So this case, this was a long-term investigation. I think it was about 6.5 years in total. This was a investment fraud where 3 guys were selling coloured diamonds to OAPs. The coloured diamonds were worth not much at all, and they made significant amounts of money. I actually didn't have the criminal case. I took this case over for the post-conviction civil recovery. So that is looking to recover funds for the victims. The post-conviction civil recovery under POCA is quite a powerful act, and it allows you to look back 6 years from the relevant date. So the relevant date was the date the gentlemen were charged, which was I think so I took the case over in 2018, but the charge date I think had been 2015. So I could go back 6 years from 2015 and look at the 3 suspects, all their accounts, all the transactions within those accounts, and then try and identify not just any criminal funds related to the conviction to this case itself, but look at any other suspicious transactions that may indicate criminality. As you know, criminals, especially money laundering fraudsters, they don't operate, they don't do one crime and disappear. They tend to have multiple crimes. So this case, different to the last one, in that the last one was very time sensitive. This was a very long-winded case that involved huge amounts of information being transferred between myself and the banks. Just go to the next slide, please. So off the top of my head, from memory, there was one fintech, but they'd not really been used. It was predominantly traditional banks. I think of the three suspects, of the three convicted individuals, there was something like 26 bank accounts they'd held over the period, so the 6 years prior to the charge date, up to when I was investigating for civil recovery, and there were tens of thousands of lines of transaction, tens of thousands of pages of paper. Of the 24 accounts, I think it was 24 accounts spread across about 15 different banks. One bank sent me a package of 5,000 A4 pages printed out, and that was their submission following the court order. I can only imagine that they dealt with someone at City London Police previously who'd annoyed them, and unfortunately I was probably the next person to deal with them, and I got given that. So that was not very helpful. Most banks do release information electronically, which is much easier to analyze, to input into Excel or input into analytical software. But I think the key takeaway from this is the building the relationships. If a good relationship with a bank, it goes a long way. We at FINTRAIL have I have a colleague at FINTRAIL who previously worked for one of the other traditional banks, and we actually interacted in our previous lives when I was in the police and she was at the traditional bank. I think, although she's not presented today, I think she would confirm that building a good rapport with the police, it's beneficial to both sides. Just go to the next slide, please, Maya. This one's it's a little bit prosaic, and I've kind of tried to simplify it as much as possible. And it's more universal than just law enforcement and financial institutions. But effectively, if we reduce the interaction between law enforcement and finance companies down to its simple kind of human factors, these are what is the time and effort it's going to take to achieve my goal. For law enforcement, most of the inquiries are going to have some type of time sensitive nature to them. If it's a SAR, it's going to be extremely time sensitive. It is very stressful working with SARs. You have a lot of money, you have victims' money, and you have to make a decision. And you have to make a decision normally on very limited information. This is not I'm not here to talk about kind of quality of SARs or STRs, suspicious transaction reports at the moment. But I will add that the more you can put in, that allows police to make a decision, the better it is. I mean, I've seen SARs that are simply 2 or 3 lines, and to identify where the suspicion is within that is extremely difficult. And normally, I think that there may be a thinking within the private sector that police have access to all these closed systems, and they're able to make a decision, and therefore just by flagging someone's name, that should be enough. Unfortunately not. Whilst we do have closed systems, we also have tight time limits, and there are rules governing what information we can access, and normally it takes a bit of time. So if a SAR or a disclosure to law enforcement is not as maybe verbose as it could be, does not add enough of a rationale to why it is suspicious, it's likely that SAR will effectively get what we call the police binned, because there's simply not enough time to go in and investigate that within the 7 days, within the normally 3 or 4 days. Regarding effort, some cases are huge. I mentioned before about Operation Goldstone. It went back to 6 years prior to 2015, 24 plus bank accounts, dozens of banks, tens of thousands of lines of transaction. All that has to be analysed. Has to be analysed by hand. The problem is you have to stand up in court and be able to talk about, or law enforcement has to be able to stand up in court and accurately talk about what they've discovered. So the effort does come into it as well. With the account that I was sent where it was all in A4 paper, that caused me a lot of grief, because I had to scan it all in by hand, and then scanning software is never as good as they make out in the adverts. I then had to go through and correct all the mistakes by hand. It took weeks. So there is that side as well. So any disclosure, although you'd like to think that effort shouldn't come into it, that law enforcement will be doing their job no matter what, unfortunately, there's simply not enough police and there's too much crime. So effort will come into it, and say if a case requires more effort than another case, decisions may be made at a senior level in the police that case cannot be progressed for that reason. When you have that situation, you then have victims that are not getting closure on a case. You may have victims that are not getting, say, money recovered for them that they've lost. It's not nice. It's not something that's really talked about, but that is the reality of the situation. There's not enough time and money in the police to investigate every, and fraud's are very complex to investigate, so to investigate every fraud to the nth degree and to achieve a successful result. So if disclosures from financial institutions are poor, if the information that comes across is in a quality or is in a format that's going to take an unreasonable amount of time to analyze and to sift through and to pass, it may well be that an investigation is shuttered because of that. Not ideal, but unfortunately that is it's a reality of the job. If you don't mind going to the next slide, please, Maya. So why is engagement important? As I said at the start, it's impossible to investigate financial crime without engagement of financial institutions. Law enforcement, we have lots of toys, we have lots of access to closed systems. What we don't have is access to the financial records. If you are a fraudster, if you're a money launderer, even if you're a drug dealer, a human trafficker, whilst they may be the predicate offences, the money's got to go somewhere, and the money, especially for fraud and for money laundering, it's the transactions that are going to make or break your case. For the other things, it adds a bit of colour to it. It adds a little bit of a kind of proof to what's been up if they're unable to explain their wealth. But it is the financial data that is integral to the successful investigations. It flows both ways as well. It's not purely reactive. Many of you will obviously deal with the police in your day-to-day lives. For a lot of it, that will simply be responding to police requests for information. But for anyone who's working in, say the front line, the second line, and you're making SARS reports, STR reports, you are proactive in your role in stopping crime. The Italian case I had, the Ndrangheta Mafia case, that was a proactive financial crime professional within a fintech thinking something was incorrect, spotting it, and that then led to a 2-year investigation, very, very successful. I got to go abroad for it, which is always a bonus when you're investigating a crime. And we took £2 million off the mafia, so that was great, and that was proactive on the part of the fintech. So flow of information, it does go both ways. It is greatly appreciated. One thing I have done in my professional career is always make sure that I kept up the engagement with the banks, with the financial institutions. Unfortunately, that's not the case for a lot of officers, not because they're rude, simply because they haven't got the time. And I personally think it's a real negative. I think when private companies contribute to the successful investigation, they should be made aware, and because the success is integral on their disclosures. So something that I would change if I was in power, not in power, but it is a very, very important part of the investigation. So hopefully people do feel that, when you submit a SAR, when you disclose information, when you send across those account transaction reports, or information on that customer, or information on potential victims of crime, it is not disappearing into a black hole. It is greatly received, and it is it goes a long way to basically creating a safer society and taking criminals off the streets and returning funds to victims. If you go to the next slide, please, Maya. So key takeaways. So law enforcement and financial institutions, they're not in competition with each other. Everyone has commitments at work. Everyone has a lot of stuff to get through. I'm sure police officer calling up and demanding access to an account or asking why information not been received in the 7 days, it's probably not nice. And it can lead to a bit of a us and them kind of situation, especially in the police. So that definitely exists. But collaboration is key. I hope that your experience with police officers and with police civilian staff is positive. And if it isn't, then it's probably that guy or that lady having a bad day. But collaboration is key, and it is, as I said before, it's hugely appreciated. Number two, disclosing information is not a bad thing. This is, I alluded to this earlier regarding fintechs not disclosing information with Tournier or FIG inquiries. I not party to the reason why, but I understand that a lot of fintechs don't have access to the FIG list, to the Financial Intelligence Gateway list of accredited officers, and that's why they need to have a DPA basically to cover themselves. Don't really know how to change that, but if your organization, if you are a senior financial crime professional at your organization, I would advise contacting the NCA regarding access to the FIG list. It does make things easier, it does speed things up, and I think it's probably better for you as well, in that you can instantly effectively check that the person you're dealing with they are who they say they are, even if it requires submission of a DPA in the first part, in the first instance, and then chatting on the phone afterwards with the individual. It does make it covers you. It allows quicker transfer information, and hopefully keeps everyone happy. Thirdly, information should be recorded in an easily accessible and understandable format. I have had, so I mentioned about being sent 5,000 pages of A4, which was very helpful. On the flip side, I have also been sent internal downloads or internal screen grabs of fintech systems. These are normally kind of bespoke systems for each fintech. They have their own version of it. And for people who do not work in the fintech or in that particular fintech, it can be very difficult to pass the information. I myself had a case where I was sent information. It was probably clear to the person sending the information because they do it every day. For me personally, I could not understand a word of it. I could recognize the dollar sign and the euro sign and the pound sign, but it made very little sense. There were terms on there as well that indicated that some transfers had not gone through and some had gone through, but these were internal kind of reference codes. But that was submitted to me following a court order. So that information is admissible in court. Unfortunately, I had no idea what it meant. And that resulted in me making multiple emails and phone calls trying to understand it, because they have to remember that whilst you are fulfilling maybe the specific words of the court order, if you are sending information, that's then going to be admissible in court, and someone like myself has to get up and try and explain that to a jury or to a judge to try and get a positive result. So screen grabs of internal systems, whilst that may technically fulfill the requirement of the court order, if it's hard to understand, it's going to be, if it's hard to understand for you or for a new person at your company, it's going to be even harder to understand for a knuckle dragging copper who doesn't work in fintech and thinks crypto is all for criminals. So please bear that in mind. I touched on SARs earlier. So SAR disclosure, limited explanations, limited details, limited context of why the reporting person thinks it's suspicious. So please make sure that if you do submit a SAR, that there is explanation there. Please make sure as well that there are contact details there, not just, I mean, this will change per company and it's probably wishful thinking, but not just a generic contact email inbox. If you are submitting a SAR, it is likely that SAR, or not likely, but there's a good chance that SAR will be actioned. And if it's actioned, then there's going to be a very limited amount of time for someone to make a decision on whether to freeze that account. Freezing the account is obviously quite, it's very serious. It needs a judge to approve it, understandably, because you are effectively taking someone's livelihood away. It's only, the next step from freezing someone's finances is to send them to prison. And I think that's maybe forgotten sometimes in the submission of SARs. I think there can be a thinking process that it's you're fulfilling a regulatory requirement or a legal requirement by submitting a SAR, but there is a real person at the other end of that SAR, and also they might not be guilty. I've had SARs where I actually froze someone's account for about 2 months. It turned out there was no criminality there. It was highly suspicious. The SAR was correct. 7 days of the week you would submit a SAR based on the information that the disclosing entity had, but the person actually, the money was not criminal, but that person was deprived of access to that money for a couple of months, whilst we had to investigate the provenance of it. So yeah, please remind that it's a serious disclosure, a SAR. So including all the relevant information, including the context of why it's suspicious. With the Italian case, someone remitting money from Italy via a transfer agent to the UK in itself is not suspicious. Thankfully, the person who disclosed the SAR, who submit the SAR, they disclose why they thought suspicious, because the person was paying a fee to transfer this money that they would not have to pay if they went direct bank to bank. So that itself is straightaway suspicious. Without that, if I'd reviewed that SAR, I may have thought, well, what's suspicious? It's an Italian citizen. I don't have access to Italian police databases. There's no open source on it. That SAR may have been binned, and we may never have got that job. So full kudos to the person who wrote that SAR. So actually, why it's suspicious in the context of your organisation. So there may be stuff that police don't know. There may be stuff that external people may not know. It may look fine on the face of it, but the suspicion in the context, or if there's a specific context why it's suspicious with your day-to-day business, please include that, and contact details, which is something that we can give you a call, give you an email, just to clarify information. If we can go to the next slide, please, Maya. We run out of time.
We have, yes. So I can. Yep, so we'll come to the end there, but thank you very much for that, Andy. If anyone has any questions for Andy, we'll have the contact details up at the end. So I think we will go over time with this section on people and skills, but I think we would rather do that than rush this one or cut it too short. So if anyone can't stay on the line, we will be sharing a copy of the recording afterwards. So hopefully everyone is able to stay and listen to this, but if not, don't worry, you can catch up on it later. So I will pass over to Sharon.
Thank you, Maya. So thanks, everyone. It's great to be part of the discussion today. By way of introduction, my name is Ciara Aitchison. I am part of the Insights and Research team at FINTRAIL. I've recently joined, having come from ACAMS and a long time in financial crime in the banking sector. As Maya says, this focus of the session is skills and people, and I think it's, as we've heard earlier, that's core to successful financial crime investigations teams. I think regardless how slick your systems and technology is, the people that support it and the outputs of this are fundamental to ensuring that you operate effectively. I think Charlie raised some of the key areas earlier: people, process, and technology. Technology can't ultimately replace people. It's how you deploy them effectively in the right spaces, and how you be innovative in our approaches to all of it. So we'll look at some of the key considerations in building and scaling your financial crime teams, and importantly, how to retain them when they're in situ. I think we invest a lot of time bringing people in and building up their knowledge, and we see a lot of movement in the industry. So I think looking at how to ensure that that career path and journey is right for your team is appropriate. So I'm lucky to be joined by two very knowledgeable and passionate individuals in this area. I'll introduce them very briefly. I won't be able to do them justice, but firstly, Ian Christie, co-founder of Think Select, a financial crime career consultancy, and I think one of the go-to places for any of your financial crime career inquiries, and Ian has a very extensive background in the industry. And then also by Simon Royce, who is a financial crime training consultant and has extensive experience in building, shaping and developing financial crime training programs across many financial institutions in the UK and internationally. Did I miss anything key there, guys? I didn't want to do any misjustice there.
All good.
Yeah. Good. Well, thanks for joining us. So I'm going to start with you, Ian. As Vito said earlier, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to building and scaling financial crime teams. But if you look at it generally, how do you think organisations can look at assessing capacity and skills needed to build and scale out from an FCI perspective?
Yeah, well, I think first thing, if you take in the assessment piece to start, the first thing that I would always look at is what's the nature of the business, and then what's the volumes of the customers and the transactions that's coming through. What's the current structure of the team and how is that made up? And then kind of, it's been mentioned earlier by Vito and Charlie, like I'm a big fan of systems, just for the record, but a bigger fan of people, just to be clear on that. But you want to conduct a good gap analysis on, the systems across the 4 pillars of surveillance. So that's TM, screening, SARS, sanctions, all right? And see what they're kind of producing. From that, you also need to know what's around the corner for the business. Are they growing? Hopefully, right? What new products are they going to be launching? Are the volumes going to increase, right? And then after that, you can basically identify what kind of headcount requirements and where the key skills are going to be for you to have the best-in-class financial crime investigations team. Now, on the skills side of things, so I can only really relate to a recent example where I feel I worked with an unbelievable fintech international payments firm and kind of built up a financial crime investigations team with them myself, which was a lot of good fun. But the key role was the leadership role, so the head of investigations. Like you can't stress it enough. You need a leader, a problem solver who can adapt to change, right? You need someone that's going to be able to work within a business that's going to support financial crime as well. They're going to build out the best in class team, and they're going to have the best advice for everybody else that everyone can learn from. But the key with that person, they need to know how to build in the rule sets, the scenarios along the alerting systems as well, right? So it's kind of a two-pronged approach of people management and systems tech. Throughout the actual teams and functions, you need good management, and then the level 1, level 2 analysts. Level 1 being transaction monitoring and screening. Okay, so like the easy, clear stuff, if you want to call it that. And then within level 2, that's more EDD investigations and SAR reporting.
And then, so you talked about sort of that adaptability to change, and I think a lot of the organizations that might be listening in today will be growing, and they will be changing their structure. Like when you look at building those teams in a way that is sort of future-proof, so building for future-proof as well as the current, what do you think of some of the key things to think of there?
First off, get the leadership right above all the teams, right? Just again, I'll stress that, just someone who can adapt to change, especially within fintechs where it's great systems all working right, but you need someone, everything changes on a daily basis. I've been working with them for quite some time, so you need just someone who's roll the sleeves up and move forward like that, and just a proper leader, right? Then a good partner internally or externally, someone who knows the market, right? You can utilize their experience on teams that they've previously built. They can provide what their competitors are doing and how they're doing that, right? Along with that, make sure you've got a very well planned out onboarding process for anyone who's joining, right? And then a big one that you'll find is offer cross training across the different functions. So anyone who's joining a firm, so I'm going to use the example of a transaction monitoring analyst, okay? So they join, they're dying to investigate, right? But for a lot of people, they join and they only just do one little part, and then it's alerted, and then it's passed on, and it goes to a different team, and it goes to a different team. You can imagine the jealousy that they've got whenever they see it going on that journey, and they're the ones that potentially found the needle in the haystack at the end of the day, right? But if you can bring them on a journey where you do train them, be it monthly, be it quarterly, anything at all, really, where you give them a flavor for the different roles that everybody's conducting. So that would be maybe transaction monitoring, be it screening, be it sanctions, be it SAR reporting, right? For one, they get their knowledge enhanced. And then from a business perspective, whenever one of those other functions gets backlogged, well, then at least you've already pre-trained them, and then they've got a bit of a core skill set there where you can leverage off that experience in those busy times. Then lastly, get reward and recognition structure in place. It doesn't have to be anything physical at the end of the day. It's just be it peer groups, town halls, huddles, anything at all, just to get put someone's name in flashing lights would be the way I would describe it. That it's just that moment of well done. It's so encouraging for individuals just to get that right. And more often than not, it doesn't really happen, but it's such an easy thing to integrate as well. So I'd encourage that.
Thanks, Ian. I think that point around that multidiscipline teams and sort of training people across it, and I know we'll come on to that, Simon, a bit more later when we're speaking to you. I think it's a very, I think it's something that you can add a lot of value to your organization as you're building up, but also then sort of longer term to scale the demands as well too. So when you're looking at the core skill sets that needed for these FCI teams, I think I probably know what word you're going to lead with on this because we talked about it before. What do you think? What are you looking for when you're looking for fresh people coming in?
Someone nosy. I love it. Right. So someone nosy that has an investigative mindset, right? Like attention to detail. Someone who knows, who just has a real passion for an investigation, but knows when to stop, right? Because you can go too deep into rabbit holes and it's sometimes it's pointless, right? But they're also someone who knows when to escalate, right? How do I discover that is a good question. So it's, if I set them, if I have a role or if I have a job, right, I'll point it out to them. They'll come back with due diligence that maybe some other people don't conduct. Interesting questions, curious questions, actually, just about the firm. They'll present me with information like about what's happened in the news recently, right? I'll look for qualifications, either via employer or, even better, if they've not been able to get it by employer, they've gone and done them anyway, right? And then just thought I would give a little idea for companies where they do have large teams, where you can kind of be a bit innovative with people. Use your staff and have brainstorming sessions, right? And just say to them, right, we're going to remove limitations of systems. Everything's off the table here. The way we're currently doing things, how would you do it if you wanted to do it differently? Get some creative ideas, creative thinking. They'll all have worked in possibly different places before with different ways of doing things. And from that, you will, well, one, you're getting people speaking, which is fantastic, right? And then two, you get some innovative thinking, which is what everyone needs these days.
Yeah. Well, sort of on that term, and I think it's coming up again, sort of that innovative approach. When you're looking at bringing in new talent and the skills needed for FCI teams, how can you be innovative in that approach? Obviously, you're the first stop in this in terms of your Think Select, but where else do you go with that too? Yeah,
well, one thing I encourage companies to do is actually, like, I will ask them questions right from the get-go, right? You can ask, like, what's your three favorite tools to use for investigation, like Google, 192.com or Companies House. That's one way. But cool way to do it is actually using digital case studies, right? So create a dummy situation and a test and present it to the analyst and let them come back to you with their findings and commentary. From that, you'll get to see how they operate, what methods they use, what like open source material that they'll use in order to conduct the investigation, and then also kind of what they use to present it. So whether it's PowerPoint versus Word, right? I know which one I prefer to see things on. You'll see their style, you see their writing, and then also once you've got that, you get to probe a wee bit deeper on why they've done things. It's kind of laid out for you. I guess it'll help on the interview procedure, and you also get to see kind of what's the analyst like at the job before they start your job.
Yeah. And Simon, on that point, then, do you have any insights from a sort of, you see them coming in at the training side of it, but how that maps into the onboarding process as well, and anything that you think would be useful from an onboarding perspective, bringing in a fresh approach?
Well, I think one of the things that is interesting about onboarding is that onboarding is an opportunity for people coming in to start becoming part of your anti-financial crime culture. It's quite interesting what onboarding training can often be, sort of 22 e-learning courses, which are just, people just get overwhelmed. And I think that if you start looking to involve that person in your culture, in your anti-financial crime culture from day one, that's a great thing, because moving on to the training, it means when they're coming to training, when they're doing their job, you've got a motivated person to train. You've got somebody who's taken that step to care about what's happening. So what I'm talking about in onboarding is there's some great videos and stuff that are out there in the public domain that people can watch, which are all about what are the consequences of financial crime? What are the real human costs of financial crime? There's so many: human slavery, trafficking, poverty, nations growing at a very slow pace, the rise of organized crime groups and stuff like that. And once people start buying into that and caring, they can see that they're part of something that has a real purpose to it. So I think the sooner you start that, the better.
Yeah, I think that the why we do what we do and what's the purpose of your role and the value it adds. I think that's sort of powerful tool to get people, as you say, bought into, because more often than not, companies focus on training the what and the process and the procedures without any of that.
Absolutely. So, I think there's an awful lot of process training which you might be able to do in other ways. And there's not necessarily enough coming together, discussion, interaction, decision-making type training.
So with that in mind, how, in your experience, how can companies bring a more innovative approach to training to ensure it's effective and sustainable for the teams over time?
Well, I think, you know, carrying on from the culture that gives you a motivated learner, there's also, you can also do things before learning activities. So if you think of the number of people that enjoy going paintballing, for example, if you tell people that their training session is going to be interactive, you're going to be divided into teams, you're going to be looking at immersive scenarios where you make decisions, people come with a different idea than you're going to sit here for 2 hours and we're going to go through about 100 PowerPoint slides. So I think that's very, very important. I think that most companies don't realize that they've got a wealth of information. Charles alluded it back to it when he was talking, in terms of, you know, existing things that have happened, SARS, internal SARS, for example, cases that they have looked at in the past that can be easily molded into interactive scenarios. So, for example, we've run courses where, whether it's a couple of hours, whether it's a whole day, where during that process of training, people are presented with bits of information. From those bits of information, they need to make decisions. And then ultimately we might have a wash up in at the end of the session where somebody decides, or each team decide through a spokesman, for example, whether to do something like retain the customer with enhanced controls, raise a SAR, exit the customer, and all these sort of things. And people have to actually present that to their peer groups. So not only do you have the element of competition, you also have that decision-making process, but also because you've got that information within your organization, you can actually look at the financial crime risks that are relevant to your organization, what the red flags might be, what your reaction might be to those red flags. So it just makes it really, really relevant for the people that are on that course. And you don't necessarily have to have long training courses all the time. You can have a scenario or an exercise that you go through in a team meeting. You know, you can keep this continuous. You could perhaps take some of your horizon scanning information and make that into some scenarios so that you can look ahead to emerging financial crime risks that may impact your organization. You can use resources within your own company. In other words, identify some training champions for your training network. They don't necessarily have to be incredible subject matter experts, as long as they can facilitate a session. So there's loads of stuff that you can do internally, which is relatively inexpensive to do. You can set some frameworks up where you take people, you have a sort of champions group, they then deliver training in lots of different events. You can even have digital training that has the same sort of focus, i.e. a scenario with a load of questions rather than people discussing it, because you would do that on your own. And then you need to work towards having things like, what is your progression of your skills? So do you want to introduce external qualifications like ACAMS or ICA into your training framework so that people can see a pathway to that expertise? And then you're going to get leverage on that expertise in how you actually train people within your organization.
Thanks, Simon. I think there's some very fantastic areas that you covered there very briefly. I think for me that continuous development is really powerful, because too often not training is just a point in time. You do it at onboarding, you maybe have your mandatory annual training and that sort of it's left, but how you can build it in so that ongoing nature is really important, and the relevance as well, making it relevant to your company, your risks, I think is very powerful too. Is there anything else you think specifically for designing training for FCIs? I know you talked about data and scenario modeling and decisioning, but anything else for FCI training that you think would be particularly useful?
Well, I think just the fact that you can use some of your SARS or other information to create those scenarios, and a couple of the other speakers already said, you know, this is interesting stuff. This is why police watch detective programs and police interceptors and stuff like that. It's interesting. And so I think not only can you do that, but you can you can also mold those. You don't have to use, you can make something up. So you don't actually have to, you can use elements of SARS and put them all together. You know, so you could put something together that, for example, covered your, you know, some of your top 10 financial crime risks, for example. But what you can do is you can make that really relevant to your audience, so people will engage. There's lots of very generic financial crime training that focuses on things like the Proceeds of Crime Act and stuff like that, more of a mandatory sort of training type approach. And I think the other thing that you can do is be very clear in your definitions. So, for example, source of wealth and source of funds seem to be two things that are not defined very well by just about everybody. If I was to say the source of wealth is someone's net wealth or an organization's net wealth to date, and source of funds is where the funds are coming from and what activities generate them, it's nice and simple. And then if you say to people, well, looking at these two things will give you an easy way of working out whether this is, you know, plausible within that timeline. So there are little snippets of information that you can simplify. And again, if you can get somebody into your training SME group who's very good at taking something that may look a little bit complicated and distilling it into some nice simple steps, that will really help, and it will help your processes run better as well.
Yeah, I think that power of having digestible information is quite key, because as we sort of talked about the volumes we heard earlier, the churn you can see on this, if you can actually look at how you can simplify how you approach things and tailor it accordingly, I think that's very important.
I think another thing, sorry is you need to get management support for training. So it's not just everyone's been on the training course and now they've done it and we're sort of all done. Which brings me to just a quick thing about effectiveness of training. And that is that most systems or training management systems are used in a way that what you end up getting information on is, what do people think of the course? So were they happy with the course? And how many people passed the assessment? The missing link is actually, how effective was this training? This is quite simple to set up. So you can, often with assessments and with surveys for training, it's done by people's learning management system. Wouldn't it be great to go a step further? And the step further is that the person goes back after being trained to their workplace and we see how effective it is. You could do this easily by setting up a poll or a survey. There's loads of tools to do this, whereby the person who's been trained does a survey and their line manager does a survey on, in other words, what has the impact of this training been? Because if it hasn't been effective, you then have to go back and say, well, why are we doing this? Why are we wasting people's time? So those are methods of being able to create some data about the effectiveness of the training and then go back and remediate it if you need to.
I think I love that, the use of the word effectiveness. It's so often bandied around in financial crime and how effective are your controls. And I think training being seen as a control and how effective is that, and that work, the impact of that, I think that's a very powerful nuance to actually maybe for people to reflect on what are they doing when they are building out training programs, to say, is it effective or is it just serving the purpose of ticking the box, we've done the training? And I think getting the needle in the right direction, and that's going to be important. So I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to quickly look at just finally staff retention. So Ian, you've got a great insight. You speak to a lot of people in the market looking for new roles and people hiring. When you see people coming to you for new roles, like what are the factors that are making them leave? What's pushing them out the door to start looking in the market?
Primary motivators, as we call them. Money. Firstly, right, and then more senior position, so they can't see where they're going next in their current role, right? There's no trajectory laid out, or they've hit the roof, right? So they move somewhere else. Better work-life balance is a big one, especially now that we're moving into the hybrid world, right? Some people just need a change of environment, which is fine, right? Sometimes they feel a wee bit stale and they need something shaken up in their life. Big ones within the investigations world, because a lot of it is volume dictated. What happens is you hire in waves of contractors, etc. So it's contract coming to an end or extending, etc. is another massive part of this world for us as well.
Yeah, I think like everyone's going to have their own individual motivators, but understanding how you as a firm can actually try and understand your own teams and then translating into keeping them is probably quite important.
Yeah.
So then, Simon, finally from you, then like what's your view on how companies can make them people sticky and have them stay? And you talked about compliance culture earlier, and I am a big advocate of making sure that the culture is right within the organization. How can you create the right culture, and how important is that in making them stay with you as well and retaining your talent?
Well, I think Ian's talked a little bit about, if people can see a career path, that is obviously a great thing. If people are, if you were running a program of continuous education. So, for example, some companies are starting to run programs within their apprenticeship schemes, which are in fact financial crime programs that are wrapped, or should I say wrap, for example, ACAMS and ICA qualifications. So if your wage bill is more than 3 million a year, then you will be putting money into the apprenticeship scheme anyway. So you want to get it out and spend it on something like this, because that's your money anyway. So having that progression is great. You usually find that I've found over the years that quite a lot of people who've progressed and progressed and progressed have actually spent the money on their own money on qualifications. So that to me would indicate that if you want to retain those people, that you need to offer them some sort of qualifications. And often companies say, you can do this qualification, we'll pay for it, and if you leave within 2 years, you pay it back, for example. So, that's one thing to do. I think people want to have a level of responsibility. In training frameworks I've set up in the past, we actually got some really young people who'd only been in the company for about 1.5 years to start running some training sessions. And in a new financial crime organization within a bank, that sort of worked, because they'd only been there a few months, but they then got into that role as well. And I think another thing that Ian was saying is that the swap over, so that banks that I've worked at, financial institutions, people might have started in financial crime operations, and then they went into fraud investigations, for example. So giving people, and it's really the ability to recognize that somebody has a skill set that, let's just forget the detail, their actual motivation and their problem solving capability, and all those human qualities could be applied at various stages and in various parts of the organization.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Ian, anything you want to add to that just before we wrap up?
No, emphasizing just that kind of, it's the career path, so you can see what's in front of you. It's so important. Right? It's just going to keep everybody engaged.
Perfect. Well, thank you both for that. I think it was a really interesting discussion, and shame we didn't have longer, because I think you could probably spend a whole session on this area as well, but I'm hoping the audience have walked away with some useful tips on it. I think for me, the cross-fertilization of skills and using that to either resource your teams or to retain your teams, I think is very important, plus that upward career trajectory, and having everyone bought into the value of it. I think some of the words around innovation and effectiveness and the why you do this are probably some of the key takeaways here. So thanks everyone, appreciate that. Thank you, Maya.
Thank you, Kira, Simon and Ian, and thank you to everyone for staying on the line and bearing with us as we overran slightly. So I think Beth is going to put up the contact details. I think the panelists have all done a really good job of answering the questions as they have come in on the chat, but if there is anything else, please do send us, or whoever you would like to talk to, drop us a line. We will also be sending out an email with a link to the recording and also these email addresses again, so if you're not able to jot it down now, don't worry, we'll be sending them around later. Thank you once again to all the panelists and to Kira and Andy for their participation in this. We hope you have found it useful. As I say, any other questions or comments, please do let us know. If you would like to talk to us at FINTRAIL about any support or advice with your investigative purposes, that would be excellent. Please do drop us a line. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you at a future webinar.